A couple of weeks ago, I did a video about how there are no good mothers in Bridgerton. How each of the women, from Portia to Violet to Mary to Araminta to Queen Charlotte and Agatha Danbury herself, are technically not good mothers. No, instead, they are all women who are flawed and who one would say are trying to do their best in different ways to do what they can for their children in the way in which they are capable. Except for Queen Charlotte, of course. We all know she's always been about her George. But I made the video, and in the comment to that video, someone had mentioned that it would have been better if I'd explored the Bridgerton fathers instead, as everyone and their mother was already talking about the Bridgerton mamas. The papas, on the other hand, have been pretty much left unexplored. And I remember when I first saw that comment, I asked myself why anyone would want to talk about the fathers of Bridgerton. Most of them are missing in some form or the other, whether by virtue of them not making themselves emotionally available to their children, which is a form of abandonment, or physically, i.e., they're dead. Plus, they don't really serve the story like the mamas do. So my question remained. Why on earth would I want to film a video talking about the Bridgerton fathers? Fast forward a couple of weeks, however, and it turned out that question, that kernel of truth to be considered, had been lodged in my brain all this while, with said brain slowly going over it as I asked myself, are the fathers of Bridgerton really missing? Do they really serve zero purpose in the story we've been given so far? The answer to that is no. Bridgerton's papas are all over the show. They wield even more of an influence than some of the mamas of the ton. So yes, this is the video where I talk about the fathers of Bridgerton. Welcome to the roller coaster ride. When we are first introduced to the world of Bridgerton, it is to a world of gleaming gowns, spectacular balls, and a society with young ladies all desperately competing for their right of place at the top of the marriage mart. It is a world that prioritizes these young women to find the most suitable matches with their mamas scheming in the background to make this so. Of course, Bridgerton is a romance series, and as such, the priority for its leads have been to lead them to their happily ever after. And with the Bridgerton matriarch being such an advocate for love matches, it only follows that she pushes for that for her children, regardless of whether or not they want the love for themselves. Even though technically we, the audience, know that they do, and that the love will be good for and to them. Violet's stance on love matches is what propels the story we are being told, as the premise at the core is to help the Bridgerton kids find the partners who love them and who are loved by them in turn. So yes, love matches are a crucial part of Bridgerton, and I do think the conversations about them and Violet's insistence on them is a great way to segment this video and try to give it some structure. What do I mean by that? Well, you see, the papas of Bridgerton and their influence, I personally think, can be categorized into two broad groups. The papas of daughters, whose actions, thoughts, philosophies, and mistakes do influence their daughters and their daughters' choices. And the papas of sons, whose expectations, shadow, and cruelty influence their sons and the decisions they take. Let's start with Lord Ledger, for example, beloved father to Violet Bridgerton, née Ledger, and not so beloved husband to Vivian Ledger, who he barely tolerates, instead choosing to stay silent in the face of a constant harping on issues that they do not see eye to eye on. Like I stated in detail in my The True Reason Why Violet Bridgerton is So Obsessed with Love Matches video, what Lord Ledger basically influenced his daughter into becoming is a woman who recognizes just how unhappy a home that is not filled with love can be, the burden it places on the couple, and how that is in turn noticed by the children who are then influenced by it, Violet herself being one of such children. And clearly, the influence of the father in this situation cannot be overstated. In a paper written by Najin Lee titled Insignificance, the participation of fathers in Jane Austen's novels, they write, "In fact, I will argue the fathers play a vital role in the development of their daughters' personalities and the social interaction they have with others. The presence of the fathers may be limited, but their influence is far-reaching," which is a statement I agree with wholeheartedly. Sure, it might have been in reference to Elizabeth Bennet and Emma Woodhouse, who are the daughters being referred to in the text, but I think it's something that applies across board to others, including Violet. Yes, we are aware that fathers during the Regency period do not often play such an active role in the lives of their children. Charlie Hodgson did do research and write for the Regency townhouse that most fathers took a very small role in the child's upbringing. Children of upper-class families would have had a nanny and often a governess who were responsible for a large part of the child's upbringing. And we see this crystal clear with younger Violet in Queen Charlotte, where it is the responsibility of her governess to help her unlearn the biases and bigotry with which her mother referred to the Queen because of Charlotte's ethnicity. But even with that minimal contact, we do see the clear adoration that Violet had for her father and how much influence he had on her, which ultimately, like I keep insisting, shaped her stance on love matches as much as her love and marriage to Edmund Bridgerton. Lord Ledger might not have been active in the 3 seasons of Bridgerton as is passed on at that point of the story, but we still see clearly his presence in the Bridgerton matriarch and how his marital experience is what propels and drives Violet's fixation on his grandchildren's matches. Then there's Archibald Featherington, whose actions have such direct consequences not just on his daughters, but also on Marina Thompson, as it is his debt to her father. So we have 2 fathers in this situation that birthed the agreement that not only brought her to Mayfair, so she could be introduced to London's society via the Featheringtons, but it is this same debt that ensured that when the truth was revealed about Marina's pregnancy, a situation that surely spelled disaster for all the Featherington girls and the Featherington name, Lord Featherington refused to budge and Marina could not be sent home. Instead, Portia had to devise a way to get her married quickly to hide the fact. One could therefore say that the entire drama with regards Marina's desperation to find a husband and thus trick Colin Bridgerton into marrying her so he could be the unsuspecting father of her children was a situation that was mostly created and thus brought to our screen by 2 fathers, hers and Lord Featherington. Because let us all be honest, if Marina was back home, no one would have caught a whiff of the scandal all the way in Mayfair. And that would mean that a core central conflict that took up the entire first season of the show and was not resolved until the very last episode would not have occurred at all. The story changed in quite the drastic fashion because of these 2 men. But Lord Featherington's influence, we can all agree, was not just limited to Marina, as it is he as well that makes the Mondriches a very core part of the ton and society in season 2, before Alice Mondrich's aunt died and made Alice's son her heir. But before Alice and Will became the parents of the new Lord Kent, they owned a bar, a place that, thanks to the Bridgertons, particularly Colin, became a watering hole of sorts for the men of the ton, where they gathered, had good drinks and conversations, and he being Will Mundrich, was able to observe and exist on the fringes of their society, which, let's be honest, Will really enjoyed. It's why he was reluctant to give it up. But the other reason why he was reluctant was because that bar cost him his pride. He had to throw a fight that he was all but guaranteed to win by virtue of Lord Featherington approaching him to do so they could both make a killing, which in turn would set Will up for life and help Archibald pay off his debts, support his family, and we can all agree, most likely gambled the rest away. The man did have an addiction after all, but he did have a very big hand in the reversal of the Mundrich's fortune, and yet he played the biggest of roles and had the most influence on his family and the trajectory their lives took within the story. His gambling debts meant that he almost deprived Philippa, and by extension us, the audience, the pleasure of Albion Finch marrying her and thus becoming a constant staple with the Featheringtons. And when his rigged match is uncovered by the members of the mob who he had basically robbed via his arrangements with Will Mundrich to throw the fight, he is killed for it and is half of the money retrieved. This in turn sets things in motion in season 2 for the return of Jack Featherington, the cousin in the Americas who, by virtue of Archibald Featherington's death, became the new Lord Featherington, which then led to Prudence being pushed into having to potentially seduce Jack Featherington, so the other Featherington girls and Portia herself would not be left homeless should the new Lady Featherington desired so. And considering the fact that Jack at this point seemed to be actively courting Cressida Cowper, that definitely seemed like the direction things were going to go. Until Portia, in her scheming, did get Prudence and Jack alone, and thus later, to secure Prudence's honor, which he had impinged upon by being alone with her, however briefly, Jack Featherington agreed to marry her. But then it is revealed to Portia that Jack is almost as broke as her late husband was, which meant that Portia was still stuck, trying to fix everything that Lord Featherington had broken before his very inconvenient demise. And that is what then kicks off the scam plot arc that we get to experience for the rest of season 2. Until the ruse is discovered by Colin Bridgerton, who threatens to reveal it to everyone in order to save the Featherington women, who he was convinced have all been taken advantage of by Jack, Portia Featherington included. Portia then makes the quick decision to betray Jack the minute he suggests that she leave her daughters behind and run away with him and the money they had scammed so far. But she does keep the money though, and in so doing, reverses the tumultuous situation that would have seen her daughters destitute thanks to their father's indiscretion. And yet, the consequences of this carries through still into season 3 with the introduction of Walter Dundas, investigator for the Crown, who is convinced that the document granting the title of Lord Featherington to the first male heir born to Portia and Archibald's daughters was a forged one, and that her coming into quite a large, substantial sum of money was just as suspicious. And so we see that even up until season 3, Lord Featherington, who we had not seen since he passed in season 1, was still playing an active role in influencing matters as it concerns his daughters and family. The entire story arc of the girls needing to birth sons is a direct result of him and the uncomfortable situation he had put his family in. And we can also make the point that this drive to have the girls birth an heir as soon as possible to help secure their line and save their homes is what ultimately led Penelope Featherington to embrace her transformation and put herself out there in season 3, as the thought of having either of her sisters be the mother to the new Lord Featherington and so lord it over her in their childhood home was something she found utterly unbearable. I think tangentially, Archibald Featherington did play a role in Penelope's storyline in season 3, and ultimately her being able to get together with Colin, because ultimately Archibald Featherington failed his daughters. And that failure weighs heavily on the story we are given and the narrative that we explore in the show. Just like Kristen Gibbs in the paper Absent Fathers, an examination of father-daughter relationship in Jane Austen novel postulates that, viewed as a group, the heroines of her novels have been endowed with the most unsatisfactory set of fathers. They fail to guide and protect their daughters, interfere with their progress towards maturity, or simply absent themselves from the responsibilities of fatherhood, with potentially disastrous consequences. And then there's the absolute vileness that is Lord Cowper, and how he is disdainful of Cressida's interest, her friendships, and anything that he deems disrespectful to himself and the Cowper name that she might be remotely connected to or involved with. And I think everyone who loathed Cressida Cowper in the previous seasons and wondered what exactly her deal was and why she could be such a hateful person, after seeing Lord Cowper in season 3 and how he treated his daughter, we get the confirmation really that people like Cressida aren't born that way. They are often forged by abusive parents, particularly fathers, who demand way too much from them and hold them to standards that would break a lesser person. Bullies birth and mold other bullies. And yes, I do agree that Cressida is a bully like her father. Her consistent needling of Penelope, her push to always humiliate her, I personally think is driven by jealousy. Jealousy at Pen's friendship with Eloise and the rest of the Bridgertons, which Cressida clearly wants, and jealousy at the fact that Pen definitely, certainly, 100% has a way better home life than Cressida can ever dream of. I'm pretty sure she's envious of Pen, who gets to just be. Read the books she wants, befriend whoever she wants to be friends with. And sure, Portia might despair at her daughter ever finding a match because of how she seems to exhibit traits that their society insists the men of the ton have no interest in. But at least she's still more of a decent parent than what Cressida has. And Lord Featherington, even with his gambling, is still a much better father than Lord Cowper can ever hope to be. But we also can't forget the fathers who are dead at the start of the story. Mr. Sharma, who passed and yet his passing had such a big impact on the lives of his wife and his 2 daughters, specifically his firstborn, Kate, who due to Mary's grief at her husband passing, found herself having to take on the burden of being the caretaker for her mother and her baby sister, while still managing their homes and accounts so they could get by. And she did all of this as a child, a decision that ultimately reflected on her tendencies to take on the burden of responsibility onto herself, that would then lead to her making a bargain with the Sheffields to secure Edwina a match with a British lord so they can pay her dowry. Kate was a parentified child who grew up to become a woman who never learned how to choose herself and put herself first. Because all her life, she had always centered her sister and mother's needs above hers. Falling in love is what eventually leads to her realizing that she is deserving of love and care. And so Mr. Sharma might not have had any screen time in the show, but we definitely see his influence in the story and character arc of Kate Bridgerton, née Sharma. And then there's the Bridgerton patriarch himself, Edmund Bridgerton, who is dead as at when the story starts, but whose influence definitely extends to both his sons and daughters. We established that Daphne is driven to be the perfect daughter as a traumatic response to Edmund dying young, and the responsibility of taking care of their siblings falling to the eldest children, Anthony, who is the oldest of the boys, and Daphne, who is the oldest of the girls. The responsibility of ensuring that her sisters are able to get good matches is equally on Anthony and Daphne herself, who is driven to make a good match so her sisters' chances are upped, even with their father not being present. In fact, one would say that it is because of Edmund not being present that the matter is prioritized for the Bridgertons. And then there's Eloise, for whom marriage and childbirth is something she's loath to even consider because she's still traumatized by their mother's response to their father's passing. But like I said, Edmund Bridgerton's influence isn't just limited to his daughters. This also extends to his sons. Like Kate, Anthony was a parentified child who had to grow up pretty quickly when his father died, as he immediately became the new Lord Bridgerton. He found himself making decisions about his siblings, about his mother and her health, and his baby sister that she was carrying. That places quite the burden on him. And when we start season 1, we see that the driving force behind just how abysmally Anthony acted with regards Daphne's coming out and her matches was because he was trying to fill in the shoes that would have been worn quite easily by Edmund as Daphne's father. But Edmund wasn't alive. And so Anthony had to be both her brother and the head of house, protective of her interests and dowry, whilst in managing the estate as the Viscount. The expectation, the drive to live up to Edmund's legacy, is what pushes Anthony through the first 2 seasons of the show, until he meets and falls in love with Kate, and finds a kindred spirit, someone who understands the burden of responsibility that is placed on older children when their fathers pass on. It's why I'm still sad about season 2, because although I love that season, I really am pissed that it was created in such a way that we really didn't get to see Kate and Anthony bond over their dead fathers and how much of an influence they had on both their lives. Because I do think that that was a great part of the books that the show should and could have incorporated in the story that they were telling. It would have been a quick scene that spoke to their mutual loss and grief for their fathers and of their childhood, and I think it would have been beautiful. But alas. And Edmund's influence is not just on Anthony. We see this reflected with Benedict as well. I, for one, think that the reason why he's so obsessed with art and creating good art that would outlast and outlive him is probably rooted in the fact that their father passed when he was just a couple of years older than Benedict's current age. And so Benedict is facing the mortality of what that means, and how it is so easy for a person to simply die in the prime of their lives. And how that thought drives and haunts him because he wants to make something of himself. He wants to leave something of himself when he passes. And he knows that the time is ticking for him as it did his father. And one can say that the reason why Colin is so close to Violet and is the peacekeeper of his family is because of Edmund's passing, and him realizing that their family needs someone, a confidant, someone who is funny, who tells them stories and brings them joy. And so he fills that role to help them not miss their father as much. We have seen kids take up the role of the jester and the confidant to help their families deal with loss. And I do see that reflected with Colin. So Edmund does have quite the influence on his sons and daughters. It might be missing from the show, but his presence certainly is not. And of course, I cannot talk about fathers and their influence on the story and not address the giant elephant in the room, that is the late Duke of Hastings, who was such a hateful, hurtful man that Simon's promised to him to make sure that he has no children so the Bassett line can die with him and the Hastings title will be passed on to another family. is what drives and is central to the plot and conflict between Simon and Daphne in season 1. Simon having to come to terms with the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, a man whose only interest in his wife was that she give him a son to continue his line, a man who abandoned said son because of his selective mutism, a man who spent all of Simon's childhood making Simon feel unworthy and undeserving of love, which in turn carried its way through in his relationship with Daphne. The late Duke of Hastings had such an influence on Simon's character arc in the story, defining the choices he makes, and ultimately is the mirror of reflection that Simon then holds up to himself to ensure that he is a much better father than his father could ever hope to be. Because yes, Simon's story does come full circle. He does end up reuniting with Daphne, and they have a son that to Simon is perfect in every way. A son that the audience can be assured will never be made to go through what Simon did with his father. It is a full circle moment that I personally find poetic with the books and the show, especially because of a certain scene in the second epilogue of Romancing Mr. Bridgerton. And honorary mention to King George, whose absence is felt strongly in the show, especially with regards Queen Charlotte, who mourns her husband and his fading memory, and cherishes the brief moments of lucidity that she gets with him. And yet, as a father, we can say that based off of what we got in the show, even though he was never really there for his 15, I still can't believe that they had that many children. Like, Charlotte pushed 15 times. What the hell? But as I was saying, he was never really there for his 15 kids. And yet the presence of him, the pressure of securing his line and throne, even with his absence, fell heavily on those kids, who had to bear the brunt of Queen Charlotte's meddling to ensure that her George would get his promised heir. She did succeed, and in this historical alternate history Regency in England that we got, that blends history with story purposes, we do know that he becomes the grandfather to Queen Victoria, who ushers in the Victorian age. So all in all, his presence might have been missing, but it was very well felt in the story. What do you think? Did my video on the Bridgerton fathers do them justice? Hit the like button if you think the answer is yes. Hit the dislike button if your answer is no. As I always say, you get to decide how you interact with my content, whether or not I've been able to influence your stance on these characters and your thoughts with regards to them. It would be remiss of me to not mention that. Share this video if you think others should hear what I have to say. It all helps my channel grow, helps me reach more people, and is incredibly supportive of my content. Speaking of support, a huge thank you to my patrons who help me keep the lights on. Thank you. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, the link to do so is in the description box. I make new videos 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. All my videos drop at 5 p.m. EST on upload days. Whilst you wait for new content from me, do check out my Penelope is More Like a Father Than You Thought video. I put in some work on that one, but it's not doing as well as my other Bridgerton videos. But yes, until next time, do remember, obsessing over the things you love, perfectly valid coping mechanism.